August 1944. A destroyed village near Limoges, France. Blackened stone foundations simmer under a heavy midday sun, and the smell of ash fills the valley. American soldiers move slowly through the rubble, their boots crunching on broken slate. They stop at the heavy wooden doors of the village church, the only structure left standing. The massive oak timbers are charred, barred tightly from the outside with thick iron rods and heavy wooden beams. Inside, the air is dead and cold. 60 civilians lie beneath the collapsed roof, their remains fused together by intense heat. A lone American soldier kneels near the threshold, staring at a small, scorched shoe. A German unit did this, then erased the location from their military maps. This is the moment that will bring a legendary commander to the scene, and his response will change how every man present understands the true purpose of the war. What Patton found in a church where the doors were barred from outside, before the fire August 1944. A destroyed village near Limoges, France. Blackened stone foundations line a silent road. Smoke no longer rises, but the smell of ash hangs in the air. Soldiers from the United States Third Army move between the ruins, their boots crunching on broken slate. They expect sniper fire or abandoned supply crates. Instead, they reach the center of the town and find the village church. It is the only structure still standing, its stone walls scorched deep black. The massive timber doors are charred, but the heavy iron locking bar remains firmly in place from the outside. Inside, the darkness reveals a sight that stops the advance cold. More than 60 people lie in the ash, women, children, and the elderly. The walls are pockmarked with bullet holes, where people tried to climb through the high windows. General George S. Patton will soon look upon this floor, and his response will force an entire German town to look into the furnace of their own making. What Patton found in a church where the doors were barred. From outside before the fire August 1944. A destroyed village near Limoges, France. Sunlight filters through a thick canopy of ash and soot onto a landscape stripped of life. The stone foundations of simple houses stand naked, smoking in the late summer air. The fields are quiet, but the silence is heavy, unnatural, and wrong. At the center of the settlement, a single stone church remains standing, its massive wooden doors charred black and firmly locked by heavy iron bars from the outside. An American soldier steps forward and forces the heavy timber open, revealing an unspeakable scene within the darkened sanctuary. Over 60 people lie inside, reduced to fused remains by an intense, inescapable inferno. Women, children, and the elderly were trapped together in the dark. General George S. Patton will soon witness this horror firsthand, and his response will redefine the meaning of absolute justice on the modern battlefield. It is August 1944. A summer breeze moves across a destroyed village near Limoges, France. The midday sun shines down on silent, blackened ruins where stone foundations sit buried under thick layers of gray ash. American soldiers walk slow lines through the rubble, searching for signs of life, but finding only ghosts. The smell of charred wood and iron hangs heavy in the humid air. Then, a sharp cry breaks the quiet near the center of the town. A young scout stands before the heavy, blackened doors of the local parish church, his hands shaking as he stares at the heavy iron bars locked tightly from the outside. What lay behind those doors would change the men of the Third Army forever. General George S. Patton would ensure the perpetrators faced a reckoning that mirrored their own cold cruelty. The field telephone rang inside the makeshift headquarters, its sharp tone cutting through the hum of active typewriters. A junior lieutenant answered, listened for a few moments, and immediately passed the receiver to Captain Arthur Miller, a 34-year-old officer from Philadelphia serving with the War Crimes Investigation Unit. The report from the village was brief but horrifying, prompting Miller to gather his maps and drive directly to the scene. When he arrived, the air was thick with the smell of wet soot and charred timber. He walked past the silent American scouts who stood like statues around the ruins of the stone church. Standing near the barred entry was a German officer who had been captured by an advanced patrol just 2 miles down the road. The man stood tall, adjusting his uniform coat with an air of complete indifference. Captain Miller walked up to him. holding an open notepad. "You are the commander of the unit that occupied this sector yesterday," Miller said. The German officer smiled slightly, looking at the charred ruins around them. "I am SS Obersturmführer Hans Dietrich, 31, from Stuttgart," he replied. "My unit cleared this area to secure the main supply route for our retreating forces." Miller looked at the heavy iron bars leaning against the church door, then back at the prisoner. "There are over 60 people inside this building," Miller said, his voice flat. "Women, children, and old men. The doors were locked from the outside before the fire was set." Dietrich shrugged, brushing a speck of ash from his pristine sleeve. "It was a standard security measure," the German said. "A partisan ambush took place on the road, just outside this perimeter. 4 of my soldiers were killed in that cowardly attack." "You killed more than 100 civilians for 4 soldiers," Miller said, stepping closer. "There are bullet holes beneath the window ledges where people tried to climb out." "They were elements of the resistance, or those who aided them," Dietrich answered, his tone sharpening with institutional confidence. "The standing regulation for this theater is clear. It dictates a ratio of 10 to 1 for every German casualty suffered during occupation duties. I merely applied the directive to prevent further disruption. If civilians choose to harbor terrorists, they must expect the mathematical consequences of their choices." Miller stared at the man, writing down the exact words in his ledger. "You sat in a chair in the middle of the town square while this happened," Miller said. "You drank coffee while the building burned." Dietrich leaned back slightly, his chin raised. "Order must be maintained by any means necessary," he said. "A commander does not leave his post during an execution of orders. This is a matter of military law, not personal feeling. Your regulations do not apply to our security actions." Miller closed his notepad with a loud snap, turning away from the German officer. He looked at the trembling scouts, then walked toward his command vehicle. "Connect me to 3rd Army headquarters, immediately," Miller told his radio operator. "Tell them what we found, and tell them who is holding the ledger." The detailed field report detailing the mass execution and the explicit admissions of the German commander reached General George S. Patton within the hour. The low rumble of a heavy engine announced the arrival before the vehicle even cleared the tree line. A lone olive-drab jeep splattered with summer mud tore through the edge of the ash-covered square and braked hard near the ruined church steps. The 3-inch steel bumper came to a sudden stop just yards from the stone walls. General George S. Patton stepped out onto the soot-stained earth, his uniform immaculate, despite the grime of the road. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the sharp afternoon light, and the polished handles of his ivory revolvers rested tightly against his hips. The young scouts stood perfectly still, their breath catching as the general walked directly toward the prisoner without a word. His boots clicked softly on the baked ground. He did not look at the ruins, and he did not raise his voice. His presence immediately anchored the entire square in absolute silence. Patton stopped exactly 3 feet in front of the standing German officer, his eyes locked onto the man's face. "You commanded this detachment yesterday," Patton said. Dietrich gave a short nod, his posture straight. "I did, General," he replied. "You ordered these men into the barns and the women into the church," Patton said. "I carried out a prescribed security directive to pacify a hostile sector," Dietrich answered, his voice steady. "You locked those iron bars yourself," Patton said. "My subordinates secured the perimeter according to my explicit command," Dietrich said. Patton stood motionless, his face expressionless as the admission hung in the warm air. "You think you are a soldier because you can read a mathematical ratio from a handbook," Patton said. "You sit in a canvas chair with a porcelain cup while old men and children burn behind iron doors. A true soldier fights an army in the open field with steel and grit. He does not wage war against toddlers in a house of God. You have brought nothing but disgrace to the uniform you wear and the nation that birthed you. The man from Tupelo found a child's shoe at that threshold an hour ago, a piece of leather that costs more in honor than your entire regiment is worth. This is not warfare. This is an abomination that the devil himself would turn away from in shame," Patton pointed a gloved finger at the heavy iron bars resting against the charred stone wall. "You have exactly two choices before this sun sets," Patton said. "You will either stand trial before a full military tribunal where every name in this valley will be read aloud, or you will face the immediate, physical reality of the judgment you carved into these walls. Decide now." Dietrich looked at the cold steel of the general's stars, his lips parting slightly, but no words came out. He remained entirely silent, his eyes fixed on the dirt. August 1944, a destroyed village near Limoges, France. Blackened foundation stones bake under a midsummer sun, sending up a thick odor of ash, baked clay, and rot. Grass on the hill is yellowed from heat and fuel oil. Soldiers from the United States Third Army walk slow paths through the rubble, their boots crunching on roof tiles. A small church stands at the crossroads, its heavy oak doors charred into charcoal and hanging crookedly from iron hinges. Inside, the limestone walls are stained with broad, greasy smears of soot that rise toward a collapsed roof. The floor is covered in gray mounds that do not look like wood ash. A young soldier kneels at the threshold, holding a scrap of stiffened leather in his fingers. General George S. Patton will soon see this church, and his response will echo through the valley, long after the fires have gone cold. 6 years after the smoke cleared from the French Valley, David Blackwood was back in Mississippi, working a steady shift at a sawmill outside Tupelo. He never talked about the child's shoe, and he never allowed a fire to be lit in his house, even during the coldest winter months, heating his home with electric coils instead. He lived a quiet life, raised 3 daughters, and died in his sleep in September 1978. Hans Dietrich did not escape the net that Patton cast across the region. War crimes investigators tracked him to a safe house near Stuttgart in the spring of 1946. Using the very aerial photographs and survivor testimonies Patton had ordered into the record, a military tribunal sentenced him to life in prison for his actions near Limoges, though he was released in 1958 during a wave of early clemency. He spent the rest of his life working as a bookkeeper, bitter and silent, until his death in 1989. Patton never recorded the full details of the church in his personal diary, leaving only a brief, single-line entry on the night of the confrontation. He wrote that some men fought for empires, and some fought for flags, but that afternoon, his army had looked into the pit of human depravity and found a reason to finish the job. He kept the official forensic files in a locked leather case under his cot until the day he died. Some historians have argued that Patton exceeded his authority by forcing the local civilian population to view the remains, calling it a form of psychological collective punishment that bypassed standard military legal channels. They suggest his actions were driven more by personal outrage and a desire for immediate theatrical impact than by a strict adherence to international legal protocols. Other historians have argued the opposite, insisting that this dramatic confrontation was a necessary act of military justice. They contend that breaking through the wall of local denial was the only way to establish the ground truth of the occupation. What is certain is that the detailed photographic records and forensic profiles ordered by Patton that afternoon became foundational evidence for war crimes investigators, ensuring that the destruction of the village could never be erased from the permanent historical record. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the investigation entirely to the rear echelon war crimes commissions? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.